right, everybody, welcome back to our experience. I am Chad Wers alongside my co host, Tom Hansel. And today we're very, very fortunate to have with us Sue Peschin of the Alliance for Aging Research. She is the president and CEO. She was probably the greatest connection that I made when I got here 6 years
Wow.
ago as CEO, at linking me to this whole world of advocacy groups and people that are really working on behalf of our older adults and trying to make sure that they get access to the care that they need. And Sue, I've told her this before, is a fighter. I admire her ability to get into the issue and not have any fear about whether it's a New York Times editor or a CMS director, making sure that they know how we feel about an issue. So I've always respected that and love that. So welcome, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Chad. And it's we have a mutual admiration society going.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun. It's interesting because um, in my work prior to coming here, I didn't have really that kind of exposure to advocacy groups, and it's so important for clinicians and for our members to know that there are groups out there that work on behalf of patients, of caregivers, and of the people that we take care of that are aligned with the way we're trying to work and do what we do every day. So it's really fun to get to do some of the things we get to do. And today we're going to talk about Alzheimer's disease, I think in particular, which is only one small component of what you do at Alliance for Aging Research because you're embedded in all the issues that affect older adults, from vaccines to cardiovascular disease, all the things. But we're going to really try to hone in on Alzheimer's, which has been a really
Yeah.
hot and interesting issue the past few years, to say the least, including, we've had some recent information to this podcast, that's kind of exciting about Alzheimer's disease. So I'll start and just ask you from an Alzheimer's disease perspective, kind of recap your last few years in this space.
That's a great question. The last few years have been a bit of a soap opera roller coaster ride, like watching a soap opera while you're on a roller coaster. But I think overall, and just sort of experiencing things this past week, it's a really exciting time in the space because we now have one FDA approved disease modifying therapy in monoclonal antibody class. And then just yesterday, an FDA advisory committee voted 11 to 0. The FDA was also very favorable, although they have the ultimate decision making authority around approval for a second one. And, having two disease modifying therapies when just a couple of years ago, there were the cholinesterase inhibitors and symptomatics in development. We also have one on label, symptomatic for agitation. That's also incredibly exciting. So I think, where clinicians may have been more reluctant to even recognize the disease a number of years ago, because they felt like there wasn't much they could do outside of directing people to support groups and, opening conversations about life plans and all that. Now there are clinical options, and that's exciting for them too.
It's exciting, and I'm glad you kind of framed it the way you framed it because it's also been like interesting on, like, it shouldn't surprise anybody. We talk all the time about 57 million people over the age of 65 today, 74 million in 2030, 90 million by 2050. If you're a business person and you're trying to solve problems, you're looking at this population, you're saying, okay, what are their problems
Yeah.
and what can I do to solve it? So if you're a drug company, you're aimed right at Alzheimer's disease, dementia, some of the neuropsychiatric problems that develop when people age. So we should expect this. But on the flip side, it seems like sometimes our agencies are trying to put the brakes on it. I think to some degree, I don't want to pick on insurance companies, but I do like to pick on them. They also want to
Sure,
put the
you do.
brakes on it. And then we end up in these very like tenuous areas where we're not equitable, we're discriminatory. Um, and
Yeah.
we're doing it under the guise of, well, the drug's not that good. Well,
Right.
we're ultimately rationing, and it's scary. So it's this really wild ride from that perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do think that, Alzheimer's has really, unfortunately, it's opened up the door for a lot of misinformation as a way to kind of justify utilization management. In some ways, COVID really introduced a lot of older adults to new technologies, on the internet, from being able to navigate telehealth, which they've gotten very good at, and there's a lot of support among older adults for telehealth visits, to more just access to medical information. More and more people, I think, knew about vaccine safety and effectiveness than you had ever heard before, right? And people actually knew who made their vaccine, all of those types of things. But on the other hand, I think that, misinformation and disinformation got a very strong hold during the pandemic, not just about COVID, but and the vaccines, but about medical information, sort of more writ large. And it allowed, I think, players in the health ecosystem who wanted to put out certain impressions, to really kind of capitalize on those types of messaging techniques. And one thing that really has us concerned is the FDA has a page now on misinformation that isn't just misinformation on science, it's misinformation about the FDA. So there was so much negativity towards the FDA. And granted, during COVID, there was sometimes funky messages that came at different moments in time. I think, Dr. Fauci tried to debunk those as quickly as possible, but sometimes things were entertained. But for the most part, the agency did a great job. There was just a lot of animus, towards the agency. And I think in the Alzheimer's space in particular, that is when the Aduhelm advisory council meeting occurred. It was over COVID, and there was a lot of controversy with that first monoclonal antibody. There was a majority vote against approval. The FDA went against the advisory committee. Three advisory committee members quit. In a rather temper tantrum like fashion, I might add, with the op ed and all that. And it raised questions about what are the roles of advisory committees and all of that. And there's just been an onslaught of press reports against these medications, a lot of it driven by the payer side. So anyway, this website that's up now, I think there's a lot of work we have to do as a clinical community, a patient advocacy community, to really help reestablish public trust in the FDA and biomedical science writ large.
Well, I think that it's a good example because I think the other thing that broke down there was this idea that the FDA and CMS and these government agencies, they work together and they know what's going on at each other's, you know, priorities. And I think what happened with Aduhelm was the FDA approved it, put it on the market, and then the biggest payer, which happens to be CMS, said, "Oh, we're not going to pay for that without these really difficult hoops to jump through." And not only did you make it challenging for people that may have looked at the FDA's decision and said, "Oh, there's an option for me now," and now they're saying, "Well, it's only an option for me if I'm wealthy enough to pay cash for it because my insurance, Medicare or Medicaid, isn't going to cover it for me, or they're going to make me enroll in a drug study and do whatever I need to do to even get it." And that's a problem because
Right.
we have to establish not only the trust in the individual agency and the health information, but that the system works because it really looked like the system broke right there.
Yeah, and I think CMS has kind of continued down that pathway. I mean, the precedent that they set with Aduhelm in the Medicare program is they created two different pathways to coverage depending on how the drug was approved. So when Aduhelm was originally approved under the FDA's accelerated approval program, which is specifically designed for life-threatening diseases where there's either no existing therapy whatsoever or patients have run out of options. And it was originally created, as you guys know, around HIV/AIDS. very effective program, lots of drugs approved under accelerated approval for oncology, for rare diseases. Very important program. And it was very exciting that this was done for Aduhelm. But CMS really cut the legs off of it by creating this pathway that if you wanted to get access through the Medicare program, you had to be enrolled in another clinical trial after it had already gone through clinical trials, as if accelerated approval weren't real approval. And it got to the point where when Leqembi went through, which first also received accelerated approval and then went through traditional approval, there had to be speeches by FDA officials about how accelerated approval is approval. Members of Congress on the House Energy and Commerce Committee had to say accelerated approval is approval. That all comes from CMS. And that should not be. You have two different health agencies under HHS essentially at war with each other. And they will say that they're not. CMS will say, no, we have reasonable and necessary. We don't do safety and efficacy. But we would argue that they are challenging that and chipping away at that each day more and more. They're starting to question clinical endpoints. They're holding meetings on, what valid outcomes are, all things that are really outside their remit, and we intend to challenge them on it.
Yeah, they're acting like a payer. I mean, they're making it easy to make the claim that CMS is really a payer,
Yeah,
and they're thinking about the cost of medications and the utilization of medications, and they're not. I don't know what the right answer is. They're not equipped to make good decisions on behalf of their beneficiaries when it comes to that, because they ultimately create the scenario where, again, if I'm a 55-year-old wealthy person that got a diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's disease, you better believe I'm going to go buy the drug. Even if my insurance doesn't cover it, I'm going to go buy the drug. What choice do I have? I think more people fear getting dementia and Alzheimer's disease than they would fear having a heart attack and something else, because
right,
it's so devastating. But then you tell a whole swath of people, yeah, you can't get it. And
right.
that's just, you can't have that.
Yeah,
Especially now with the new Inflation Reduction Act, which we only know the first 10 drugs in 2026, but they're
Sure.
going to be brand drugs. They're going to be these type of drugs that have been released. I can't remember what the rule is. Like you can't put on the IRA if it's not been 7 years or something of that sort.
9 years for a brand and 14 for a biologic.
But I imagine these drugs right here, specifically for Alzheimer's, is going to be targeted. These, whether they're working or not is really the thought process of CMS. It's just how much do they cost.
Well, it'll
well,
be based on how they're used.
yeah.
Well, they won't make the list because CMS won't pay for it. So right now they wouldn't make the list. Um,
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
well, CMS is using a tool that they essentially made up that's called coverage with evidence development. They interpreted it through guidance back in 2005 out of national coverage determination. And they said they could add this study requirement onto national coverage determinations, which are themselves a type of utilization management. But this is kind of like an Uber layer of utilization management where you have to be able, as a beneficiary and as a clinician, have access to what tends to be wealthier urban big academic centers in order to participate in these types of clinical studies. And we did a report back in February of 2023 called Facade of Evidence, because it really is a facade. It's not really designed to answer clinical. They set up these clinical questions that are near impossible for the study participants to ever answer, and they're not supposed to. It's really just to cut utilization and ultimately cut costs. So it's been used for primarily in the device space, cardiovascular, TAVR, for some of the stem cell replacement procedures for cochlear implants. And it significantly reduces to the point where it's just a very small fraction of patients end up getting access to the therapies that are under coverage with evidence development. So those are for items and services that are under Part B in Medicare. And that's where biologics tend to go. So while it might seem amazing that biologics get that 13 years of exclusivity and small molecules get the 9 years, they're going to rein in those 13-year products with coverage with evidence development. And we're already seeing it. I mean, they just recently held a meeting on self management devices for diabetes. And they're talking about it for cell therapies that are coming down the pike. So and they're going to be putting out guidances this summer that we all need to work together to respond to as well.
So where do you see that going? Is this going to continue to get worse for a while before it gets better? And then I'm not just talking about Alzheimer's now. I'm talking about any products that are coming out that face this coverage with evidence determination scarlet letter, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the agency put out one for devices, TSIT, and then coverage with evidence development. They reformulated the study criteria on that. That'll come out. They reformulated the national coverage analysis and how they look at clinical endpoints. And this sounds like a whole bunch of gobbledygook, quite honestly. But it's a way for the agency to create these like really broad questions that are essentially unanswerable, to say like we're doing what the FDA is not doing properly. We're following up and looking at things in the real world to see how things are for all the beneficiaries that Medicare represents. But in the report that I mentioned, Facade of Evidence, we should, I mean, what they do is they often justify extending coverage with evidence development because the CED studies themselves don't enroll underserved populations. They don't get to the people who need the products. If anything, they're worse than the clinical trial processes. So it's really a misnomer that it's all about like the wider beneficiary population.
So I know you guys talk a lot about equitable access, and that's a forward thinking thought process. My question to you is going to be kind of how do you guys go about making sure that that happens? There's only so many seats at the table, so to speak. So give me an idea of how you continue to push in those directions and get those seats.
Yeah, I mean, one area that we look at is around how we value new medical products. Traditional value assessment, traditional cost effectiveness is really quite discriminatory against older adults, against people who are sicker, who have uh, live with disabilities, and also people of color. Because if you have an average shorter lifespan, it's going to cost more to treat you with something new. And and when you put a measure on someone between 0 and 1, right, which is what the quality adjusted life year does, it will basically make the calculation more expensive to treat you. And these are the exact people who need the treatment. So that needs to be banned, and we're working on that. We're supportive of a quality ban. There is one through the Affordable Care Act that banned it in the Medicare program, but we want to make sure that it's banned in Medicare Advantage and throughout the VA and all the health programs that are under HHS. Also, Medicare, I think, gives a bit of a wink and a nod to it. So the National Council on Disability, which is a government advising agency, has basically concluded that there needs to be a ban in actual statute that's enacted by Congress. So that's one big way. And then another smaller way that we're going to be pushing for, just even in this at this next ASIP meeting around vaccines, is to have more of a universal age and a lower age for a lot of the adult recommended vaccines, because African Americans, Hispanics often are at risk of getting infectious disease at younger ages and more severely. but the vaccine recommendation might not be till 60 or 65. And we saw these actual studies out of the CDC itself in for pneumonia, for RSV. So we need to lower those ages. Now we don't want to lower them and just have a whole bunch of white people in their 50s getting a lot more vaccines, right? So it has to be coupled with outreach and education, but we need simplification of a lot of these recommendations.
I think both agencies have to get better at making recommendations in within populations, niche populations. They have to be able to say,
Right.
you know what, we are going to say that if you live in a nursing home, there may be a recommendation for you that's different from an older adult that doesn't live in a nursing home. Your culture, your background, your ethnicity, your genetics, all of those things may influence a recommendation. And I think we still spend a lot of time, you know, at the FDA side and the CMS side of making blanket decisions. Like, you know, I'll use RSV as an example, the shared decision making.
Yeah.
If I don't know that I followed close enough to see where that came out. I would probably argue that if you are above a certain age, you are vulnerable. You should be recommended to get the vaccine. Maybe if you're in a 10-year period prior to whatever age we define, then it's a shared decision making. But if you're in a nursing home, if you're in an assisted living environment where you're in a congregate care area,
Right.
you should be able to make those decisions. You need it. Like,
Right.
it's not a shared decision making. You live in a building with 80 other people that if one of you gets the infection, 30 of you are going to get the infection. So it's
Yep.
we've got to get better at that.
Can I tell you an RSV story? I know that our topic is Alzheimer's, but I have an
That's okay.
RSV
Sure.
story.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I'm from Pittsburgh, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Go Pittsburgh.
Oh, about that.
I
I'm going to balance out any kind of Cincinnati
The
stuff.
fans.
like that
Oh,
Tom. He's a good guy.
So we know she's smart. We
Right.
should have started off with this.
um, but so my dad lives there. He's a pediatrician for over 40 years in Pittsburgh, big vaccine advocate, as you know. Yeah, and he's turning 85. We're actually going to Pittsburgh to celebrate his birthday this weekend. And two primary care docs and one cardiologist recommended against RSV vaccine for my dad and then also for my stepmom. They're both, over the age for the recommendation. My dad has heart disease, unequivocally should have had the RSV vaccine. UPMC system had a video up with a doc on it that said RSV vaccines not ready for prime time. And on the pharmacy side of UPMC, the messaging was, hooray, RSV vaccines are here. So the right and the left hand don't really seem to know what they're doing. But the shared decision making kind of option, and I know I've been saying utilization management a lot, but it really does serve that purpose because it confuses doctors. They look at something like that and they're like, we don't know what to do with this. So we're just not going to deal. Right. And there was nothing inaccurate in the video that the doctor, but if you just looked at the title and nothing else, which probably a lot of people did, you just said, oh my gosh, okay, I don't want to get involved in that. Right. So that's why my dad, he even went back after I sent the clinician, recommendations from CDC. Now, at this upcoming ASIP meeting, they are supposedly having a discussion. And I hope that they turn back that part of the recommendation. And I also hope they clarify on risk of Guillain-Barré and all of that because, we're heading into season in just a couple of months, and it's going to determine how things are going to go one way or another. Yeah, CDC just they have to get down to simpler across the board recommendations. And you got to recognize that along with that, there'll be some people that won't be at higher risk, necessarily. But is it really so bad if they get a vaccine, right? So better that more people, should get it, and you capture the ones who really need it.
right. No, I think that's exactly right. And I agree with you. I hope there's a lot of things they need to make simpler going into fall. And I hope that we're able to accomplish that. They need to be The strains need to be identified for both flu and COVID faster. They need to be available by end of August. They need to be out to the vulnerable populations first,
Yeah.
uh, preferably, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And it's exciting to see the development with the combo vaccines for respiratory. I hope that
I worry about
continues.
that too a little bit, Sue, though, because we have the new high dose vaccine for older
Right.
adults recommendation. My big fear is we're going to come out with a combo, but it's going to be regular flu, COVID, and it's not going to be designed for that older adult that needs that higher dose. We'll see. Maybe they're smarter than I'm giving them credit for, and I hope that's true. But I don't want them to forget about, again, the
I
older
agree.
adults that we take care of. They're the ones that bore the brunt. They bore the brunt of influenza. They bore the brunt of COVID. They got stuck with a shared decision making. Like they're the ones that need the vaccines.
Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
it
Yeah.
should be simple.
I will say the results that came out yesterday did compare against the enhanced vaccines. So it's looking good.
Well, that's another thing too
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
the flu is also. I think they're working on an mRNA version of the flu, which could be very different in terms of how effective it is. So that may wash away the concern, but we have to stay on top of those things because we know if they can make a sideways decision, they might.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Murphy's Law.
Let's ask one more question. Like, where else? What are the other hot points? I know we work a lot together on neuropsychiatric symptoms. We work a lot together on vaccines. You talked a little bit about, which I think is really important, differences in populations in terms of age, like arbitrarily saying 65. You're exactly right. That's arbitrary. Um, Age needs to be a function of your comorbidities and your frailty. What's the next? What else should we be focusing on as we start to the wave starts to crash of older adults in this country?
I think that we need to pull the puzzle pieces together a little better about the population shift that I know you always talk about, Chad, but I think that we're not, everybody is kind of putting out fires right and left. They got IRA distracting some folks, they have coverage with evidence development, challenges to the FDA, all that. I think we need to pull it all together under the umbrella of how are we really caring for our nation's older adults? I've been thinking a lot about the word entitlement. And today, a lot of the focus on entitlement is, a way to kind of be a little bit, I think, critical of younger people, right? They're so entitled, that all that. But we forget that entitlement was something that was really created for older people who had contributed their entire lives into the economy and supported these new programs that came about in the 60s. Um, and that's something that you earn over time. And I think we need to kind of reclaim that and talk about how we need to do better. That we can't approach this from a standpoint of slashing and burning, and that our taxes, that this whole idea of bankrupting Medicare and all that, these are political slogans, and we need to pay for the people who served this country, who gave their sweat equity, and because that's going to reflect on all of us as we get there ourselves, how we treat each other. So I want to change that conversation. And really challenge all of us. There's no doubt we need to talk about affordability in healthcare, but the dynamic of every particular groups are burdens to society, that can't be anymore. We need to change that paradigm.
No, that's a good one. I think you're right on with with that. I mean, they are the baby boomers. They have changed everything about everything as they've moved through. So I anticipate they're going to hold us accountable
Yeah.
for fixing it. because
Yep.
that's going to be their expectation. And to your point, and again, not in a negative way, they're entitled to that. They fought the world wars. They built the country.
Yeah.
We need to do right by them and make sure that they have a system that works. And I think what's interesting, and I talk about it a lot too, is the conversations with people have changed really dramatically in the last 10 years. We all know somebody that's experienced bad health care in this country,
Yeah.
and it's generally a family member, a parent, a grandparent. The more that that's happening, the more you're building this, momentum to fix things, because nobody wants to deal with that.
Yeah.
I used to joke all the time. I was like, I wish this congressperson would have somebody in a nursing home, or I wish, because then they would understand what
Yeah.
we're dealing with. And I think that's happening more frequently. I'd like to think it is, and hopefully that's going to help. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good to be optimistic.
Right.
Well, I think we need to really just encourage people to just side with their better angels and do the right thing,
Yeah. We
and we
talk. We
are
talk.
we're working together, and we'll make it happen. And it really is all about like just working across disease areas, across clinicians, patients, industry. No one group can do this by themselves.
Right. And we need to all remember, like, what would you do if it's your dad, if it's your
That's
mom? What would you do?
Right.
right.
You wouldn't say, Dad, sorry, this is really expensive. You're going to have to try this really difficult drug regimen, and I hope it works. And then if it doesn't, maybe we'll give you this nicer medication or therapy. Like, nobody wants to do that. Let's
Right.
figure it out. Let's figure it out.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
Tom, any last thoughts?
No, I just want to thank Sue and the Alliance of Aging Research. I mean, this is what we spend our careers focusing on, is how to provide better care. And if it wasn't for the work that you all did to continue to create that awareness and that advocacy, it'd be a much bigger uphill battle than we already face. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Chad. And as I've
Yeah,
said to Chad before, you guys had me at consultant pharmacists.
that's awesome. We take a lot of heat sometimes for that, but I'm glad that we had you at consultant pharmacist. You're,
Well,
you,
Sue had me at Pittsburgh, so go Steelers,
that too.
go Pirates, go Penguins.
All
Um,
right.
you for being on. We love our relationship and our partnership with the Alliance and with you, and we'll keep fighting for the right things.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time on Our Experience.